Good afternoon and welcome to Croydon Serving the Adventist Church. We want to welcome you back to this afternoon session, which is focused on lifestyle. And today we are blessed to have our own church member, Natalie Harris, who is a dietitian. She's been working with the NHS for more than 2 decades, and we are blessed to have her. She'll be talking about cancer and the dietary myths. So before we go into it, let us have a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for bringing us back, and it is our prayer that, Lord, you continue to teach us because you are the master teacher. And we commit Natalie into your hands, oh God, that illuminate her minds so that she can lecture or give us the information and the needs so that we can practice them and live healthy. This is our humble prayer, oh God. We pray for those listening as well that we may learn something from it and we can all live. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, so thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and as Pastor said, I'm going to be talking about some of the myths that surround diet as it pertains to cancer. So really, what I'm going to talk to you about are the things that lots of patients who come to see me and outpatients talk to me about, the things that they ask me, having this cause my cancer? If I don't eat this, will it cure my cancer? What are the things that I should maybe tell my family that they should or shouldn't do? So hopefully I will get into some of that today. I'm looking forward to your questions. Last time you really challenged me, and I'm sure you're going to do the same again. And I will just say I am a dietitian, so my knowledge is around nutrition and food. If there are things that I am not too sure about, I will let you know that, and I'm happy to go and have a look at things and check with my colleagues and come back to you on anything that is outside of my area. So I'm just really looking forward to having another session with you today. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to have a look at diet and cancer myths, and I'm Natalie Harris, as was said earlier. So the first thing that we really want to have a look at, and these are the sorts of things that patients ask me about. Can diet prevent cancer? And definitely in our last talk, we went through lots of the diet and lifestyle elements that can help to prevent cancer, and we know that up to 40% of cancers could be prevented by people following a healthier lifestyle. Can diet cure cancer? Actually, it's against the law in this country to say that you have a diet that can cure cancer, because we know from the evidence that diet doesn't work in the same way as a drug. So actually, if anybody says that they can cure your cancer with a diet, you should be very wary of them, and you should really question what their motives are for getting you to try and follow the thing that they want you to do. And then we'll have a look at some of the common questions that people ask about special diets. We're going to go through the different topics. I've just picked out a few. Next week, my team will be talking about a lot more, and they'll have a whole morning to do it, but I've just got an hour with you today, so I've just focused on some of the most common things that people will talk to me about. Okay, so to understand some of the things that people come to talk to me about and why maybe they think a particular food, or doing something or not doing something might help with their cancer, the things that they've been told or the things that they understand is that does it cause the cancer to grow in the first place? Did eating this food cause my cancer? And that's often seen in the literature as proliferation. I'm just kind of sharing these words with you. You don't have to remember them, but if you are searching the internet and you come across these terms, then hopefully you'll flick your mind back to today and think, oh, actually, yes, I remember what that means. The thing that often they'll say is it kills cancer, and that's a term it roughly equates to something called apoptosis, which is about how our bodies work, and our bodies are constantly renewing all the time. So we are growing new cells and cells that are old and have become damaged, they get a signal that tells them it's time to die and to be replaced with fresh cells. And that signal is apoptosis. And what happens with cancer cells is they're able to evade or ignore those signals, or they can kind of make the body not recognize that they're defective so that they can keep growing and become a cancer, and maybe even go on to other sites and grow there. And then the third thing is about starving the cancer. So that's another thing that you might hear or see online. And really, one of the things that we know is that cancer cells are very adept at surviving in low levels of oxygen, which healthy cells are not. Our cells are really designed to thrive in a good concentration of oxygen. So actually, the cancer cell then has an advantage because it can survive with less oxygen, something that would kill another cell, and it will go on to replicate. And there's different ways that it works to be able to do that, and in some ways it kind of shares some of its food with other cancer cells to allow them to grow and to survive by the way that it replicates. But really, so lots of the cancer drugs are trying to starve the cancer, trying to induce apoptosis, or trying to reduce proliferation, the amount that it grows. And then the people who talk about diet also then potentially buddy onto those claims and say that the things that we're going to look at might do the same. And they may, or they may not. We're going to find that out together today. So the first thing that I'm going to cover is dairy, and it's one of the most popular things that when I do talks with patients as groups or in individual consultations that they ask me about, and they'll say to me, does dairy cause cancer? And so just to set the scene, when we think about dairy, we're talking about all of these things that are listed here. And probably a few other things that I haven't put on here, but things that are, on the whole, the majority of their ingredients or components are milk-based. And I've put at the bottom that it includes full fat and low fat, and some of the studies that have been done have really looked to see whether there's a difference, and actually, does the fat component of the milk cause any benefit or harm? So if you kind of start to tease out the different kind of types of fats or levels of fat that are in there, they look at things like the calcium levels to see actually does that make a difference. Then you'll see that they've done some really hopefully we will see they've done some really rigorous studies. And these types of studies really are generated by people who have cancer and people who are interested in it, because they've come to us and said, we think, sorry, I'll try not to do that again. We think that what we've eaten may have contributed to us having cancer. And they have then kind of spurred the scientists on to have a look back and design studies that can find out the answers to these questions. So some of you may have seen these books, and some of you may have heard of somebody called Professor Jane Plant. She was a geologist who developed breast cancer, and she started to do her own research into thinking what may have caused her cancer, my cancer, at the time that she was with us. And she kind of came up with a theory that the reason that women had breast cancer was because they consumed a lot of dairy. And she compared us to women in the East, in places like China and Japan, where they have much lower incidence of breast cancer. And she then drew that conclusion that it was because people were eating dairy that they were then getting breast cancer. So her thoughts were that maybe the dairy contained cancer-causing hormones that actually drove the cells to become cancerous, and to maybe the cancer cells to continue to grow. And the other thought behind it was that dairy increases things called insulin-like growth factors. And those are the things that are naturally present in cow's milk, but the thought was that they can drive cell proliferation and therefore promote cancers. So we had a look, and the evidence I'm going to talk to you about is based on 153 different clinical trials that were done. But actually, it was a much bigger piece of work. In 2019, they looked at all of the trials that were out there that looked at dietary intake and development of cancer. And they they discounted a lot of trials because they weren't strong. So they didn't think, oh, we're just going to take everything and see what comes out in the wash. They looked at, did they have rigor? Were they well designed? Were they looking at the right thing? Did they have enough people in the study to actually find out the answer to the question? And the conclusion was that actually there was no evidence of statistically significant association between milk consumption and most cancers. And they looked at a whole different host of cancers. They looked at hormone-sensitive cancers like breast cancer and prostate cancer. They looked at gastrointestinal cancers like esophagus, stomach, colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer. They looked at blood cancers like multiple myeloma, like leukemia, like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And actually, for most of them, there was no statistically significant association. And more importantly, it didn't increase cancer mortality. So those people who included dairy in their diet did not have a higher chance of dying from their cancer. But I said most because there was an exception. So they did find that there was a small group of studies that showed that people who had prostate cancer had an increased risk if they consume dairy products. And there have been a lot more studies that have looked into that to try and tease it out to see whether it's the calcium element of the milk, whether it's the fat element of the milk. And some of the things that came out was that they felt that there were some hormones in the milk that were maybe driving the development of prostate cancer. So I found that really interesting, and I had a further look in to see what was that hormone and what was the thing to take away for people in the UK. And it was interesting because it was looking at the growth hormones that are sometimes given to cows to stimulate them to produce milk, and that can spill over obviously into the milk, and then we consume it and it increases our risk. But that is only in kind of North America, and actually in the UK, we don't allow growth hormones to be given to our cows, so we don't have that issue. So if you are further afield, yes, it may be something that you need to be concerned about, but probably for people in the UK, it's not so much of an issue. And what was really interesting as well was that people who had colorectal cancer, there was really strong evidence that actually dairy decreased their risk of getting colorectal cancer. So it definitely should be included in the diet. There's absolutely no reason not to. If you are at high risk of prostate cancer, then you may want to have a discussion with your health professionals. Okay, so I'll stop now and see if there are any questions that have come in. And if not, then we will have a look at soya.
At the moment, there are no questions. I think they are preparing to bring in their questions, so you can move on, and they'll bring the questions.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so we'll go and have a look at soya. So that's another thing that lots of people come to me in clinic and they say, actually not so much, they're not as much worried about does it cause cancer, but there is a strong feeling that by taking soya, they may actually cure their cancer. And part of that is linked to the lady that we were talking about before, Professor Jane Plant. Part of her thing that she recommended people to do, and that she did herself, was that she felt that by taking soya, it would help to reduce the incidence and the risk of breast cancer. And it's not something that will cure it. It's not by if you develop breast cancer, and then she then went on to draw the same conclusions for prostate cancer. It's not that if you start taking it, it's going to cure your cancer. But it did drive a lot of scientists to have a look. And they had a look, and they looked at what are the factors that, particularly with people in Eastern countries like China, why they had lower levels of breast cancer. And some of it was about the fact that they had their children earlier in life. Some of it was because they consume less alcohol, and alcohol is a definite risk factor for breast cancer. And then some of it was also that they have much lower rates of obesity, and because fat drives hormone production, if you have a lot of subcutaneous fat, it increases your risk, as we spoke about in the first talk, about developing cancer. So that kind of really took care of why, for the most part, people in those countries tended to have a lower incidence of breast cancer. But actually, when they looked at their soya intake, they also found that soya was protective. And soya has an active ingredient called an isoflavone, and it's a type of estrogen. So if you do some research online, you may find it called a phytoestrogen, and phyto just means comes from a plant origin. So it's an estrogenic compound, but it comes from plants, and it's much weaker in its activity than our own body's estrogens. But there was a thought from the scientific community when they started to look into it that actually were these isoflavones dangerous? So most breast cancers are estrogen receptor positive. And so some of the treatments like tamoxifen are looking at trying to block those estrogen receptors so that the cancer cells can't continue to develop, and it's a very successful drug. But what you don't want to do is then, by giving something which, like tamoxifen, which is lowering the circulating estrogen levels and its ability to bind, then flood the system with something that acts just like estrogen and then is going to overwhelm the system and cause more problems. So they started to do a lot of research looking at whether these isoflavones were actually helpful or harmful. And then we kind of went off onto a bit of a red herring because of the way that studies work. So there are often 3 levels of studies. So they often do like what we call preclinical studies, where they'll look at things in petri dishes like cells, or they might use what we call an animal model, so things like rats, and grow human cancers in them and see whether the thing that they're trying to look at is either helpful or harmful. So they may give them, say, potentially new cancer drugs and see what the impact is. Does it cure the disease? Does it kill the patient, the rat? What kind of impact does it have? What kind of toxicity? And by that I mean, what kind of side effects do people get? Is it harmful to any of the other organs other than the cancer that you're trying to treat? So you have that level of study. Then you have different levels of kind of phase trials. Phase 1 trials, where they're giving things to humans, but really just to see whether it's actually tolerable. Can you give it? Is it dangerous? What kind of side effects might you get? And then phase 2 trials, where you're giving it to people to try and see whether there's any kind of anti-cancer effect. And then phase 3, where you do a really large-scale trial with lots of people and you compare it to the current gold standard treatment to see whether there's any effect. And when they did the early studies in rats, they kind of came back finding that isoflavones were driving breast cancer in those rats. And then that led to us thinking that actually it would be harmful for humans. But actually what they then found was that the way that rats work is they metabolize the isoflavones differently to humans. So actually, when we have the isoflavones in our diet, they work quite differently. So actually, they didn't have the same problem. So actually, what they found was that isoflavones were actually beneficial for us rather than harmful. But still, there's not been as many studies looking at very high levels of isoflavones that you get in estrogenic supplements. So certainly, as a dietitian and your oncologist will probably tell you not to take them because we don't know whether in very high levels they are harmful, but certainly soy in the diet is definitely beneficial. So what they found when they did the work in humans was that the isoflavones actually seem to bind to the receptors that reduce cancer risk. So there are alpha and beta receptors, and the isoflavones bound to the beta ones, which are the ones that actually reduces cancer risk. And they also seem to stimulate apoptosis. So the thing that we were talking about right at the beginning, where if you've got a rogue cell that's become cancerous, you want to tell it it's time to die, that it needs to stop growing, it needs to stop dividing and forming more cells. Isoflavones seem to stimulate that pathway. And in the studies that they've looked at, a lifelong diet in soya that's rich in soya tended to reduce breast cancer risk. But I will have to say one thing, that the amount of soya, and they looked at, they did most of this work in people who were living in the East, like China and Japan. Their intake of soya is about 10-fold higher than ours. They eat a lot of soya, and a lot more than we do, and that's why it's protective. And the other thing that they found out was that you needed to kind of be taking it kind of around the 12 to 18 years of age kind of bracket for it to actually be beneficial. So lots of my patients who were kind of either just perimenopausal or postmenopausal and were kind of coming onto the bandwagon of soya, they were kind of coming into it too late, because you needed to have taken it much earlier in your life for it to really be protective. So that's why that point is there, that it needs to be a lifelong diet rich in soya, and it reduces breast cancer risk. So it's not too late for your children, especially if they're vegetarian, to try and increase their soya intake and give them a lot more. And the less processed it is, the more soya it has. So if it's things like tempeh or kind of that type of stuff, or edamame beans, where it's actually the soya and you're eating a lot of that, you're taking in much more. But when you get down to things like soya milk, soya sauce, soya beans that have been added to kind of products like burgers or sausages, the levels are much lower. So to get enough soya, you would have to eat absolute kind of a lot more of it than, say, the people in China who are eating it in a much, much less processed form. And there was a study that was looking at mortality and recurrence, and they found that if they were taking in a soya intake of about 11 grams or 40 milligrams of the isoflavones, that it was reducing mortality by kind of up to 10% and recurrence by between 8 and 11%. So there was like a dose response. So the more you ate up until you reached roughly the 11 grams or the 40 milligram mark, the kind of better benefit you had. But if you exceeded that dose, then you didn't actually get an additional benefit. Okay, we'll see if there are any more questions, or any questions that have come through. And if not, we'll have a look at turmeric.
Yes, indeed, there are some questions here. And the first one, it has been said that cancer feeds on sugar. Can high sugar consumption cause cancer?
Okay, so that's another question that I get asked a lot in my clinic. And I have got some slides on this later, but just in case we run out of time, I will say the short answer is probably no, but because it's something that people are interested in, they're actually doing a lot of studies at the moment to try and find out the answer. But we do know that people who eat a diet that is high in sugar are much more likely to be overweight or obese, and we know that obesity drives cancer formation. So as a dietitian, I'm going to encourage you to reduce your sugar intake and to manage your weight at a healthy level, because that actually we definitely know is protective against developing cancer.
Thank you very much. The next one is, I understand that we are born with cancer cells. How true is this? Okay,
so I wouldn't say that that's true. Cancer cells are our own body cells, so if you look at it from that perspective, yes, because we're all completely formed of cells, but those cells are the process of metabolism, so the way of keeping the cells alive. There are metabolic pathways that are triggered where free radicals are formed, and those free radicals have the potential to damage the cells and cause cancerous changes. And if that cell becomes or has cancerous changes, then ideally the body's own immune system should recognize that and send out things like natural killer cells to kill that cell, or signal apoptosis, which is a trigger to the cell to tell it to die, so that those cancerous cells do not continue to grow and to form a cancer. But what happens is, particularly as we age, and maybe we're exposed to more of those environmental factors or genetic factors which predispose to cancerous cell formations, we're not always as efficient at recognizing, and some cells develop so that they evade some of the natural kind of ways that the cancer cells would be told either to die or would be attacked by the body's own defenses. And then that's when they kind of learn how to evade those mechanisms, that's how they grow and become cancer cells. And they have to get very big, potentially, to cause problems. So often, if you're waiting for symptoms to develop, often the cancers are quite advanced because they've become quite big by then.
All right, thank you very much. And the next one is that my diet is mainly salt or salt-based foods due to very low blood pressure. Is salt a risk of cancer?
Okay, so salt is not per se a risk for cancer, and so although there is a message out there that we should try and reduce our salt intake, that is actually linked to preventing stroke. So what we know is that there are quite a few people out there who have undiagnosed high blood pressure, and for those people, consuming a high salt diet will increase their risk of stroke. So because it's very difficult to pick up those patients, there's a blanket healthy eating message out there that says reduce your salt intake. But for certain people, and the person that's wrote this is probably one of those who actually has a slightly different metabolism to the rest of the population and has a low blood pressure, they may need salt or other things to help maintain it. And another type of person, somebody who's had something called an ileostomy, where they've had some surgery to their intestines and their waste material comes out into a bag, they need to add extra salt to their diet to kind of maintain their circulating serum sodium levels and to be healthy. So for most people, salt is about protecting against stroke, but it doesn't cause cancer if you have too much, but it can be dangerous if you've got undiagnosed high blood pressure.
Thank you very much. Then the next one is, what are the benefits of soya milk versus cow's milk?
So I would say that probably there are pros and cons to both. So in terms of soy milk, it depends on the type of soy milk that you're having. So if, say, a patient was with me in clinic and we were sitting and talking and they said, look, I really don't want to eat cow's milk, I would much rather have it from a plant source, then I would say that's absolutely fine as long as you are choosing something that has been fortified with calcium, because soya is actually not that high in calcium. So if you have a soya milk that hasn't been supplemented, then your calcium intake drops a lot. And particularly for, say, women who are postmenopausal, calcium intake is very important to prevent things like osteoporosis. So you want to make sure that your soya milk is supplemented. You also just need to be careful about whether it's a sweetened or an unsweetened version, because the sweetened versions have sugar in, which is not so healthy for your teeth, whereas cow's milk, the lactose that's in there is not particularly harmful for teeth. So I think you would just want to have a look at those things. And you'd also, if it was a patient that was sitting in front of me, I'd be asking them, are they able to maintain their weight? Because we know that maintaining a good muscle mass helps to get people through treatment, and it helps to improve their chances of having a good outcome. So if they say to me, I'm eating really well, I don't have any problems taking in enough nutrition, then I would say it's fine to stick with soy milk, because usually it's quite low in calories, the equivalent to, say, between semi-skimmed and skimmed milk in terms of that. But if they were struggling with their weight, then actually I might say to them, well, maybe you should consider including some of the higher calorie dairy options in your diet, just to help maintain that muscle mass, because that's actually the most important thing going through cancer treatment. But for most people in the general population, they are not usually so worried about their weight. If anything, they're worried that it's going the other way and it's higher. And so then substituting in something like soya milk would help, because it might take some of the calories out compared to, say, semi-skimmed or full-fat milk. But also there are other milks out there as well, so it doesn't just have to be soya. If you don't want to have dairy milk, you could substitute it with almond, hazelnut, coconut milk, oat milk. There's rice milk. There's absolutely loads out there.
Thank you very much. And the last question for now is that which kind of cancer has got the highest mortality rate, and what will be your admonition in controlling or preventing this?
Sorry, so which cancers have the highest mortality rate, and what was the second
What would
bit?
be your recommendation, your advice in how to control or prevent?
Okay, yeah, okay. So I am absolutely happy to be, for someone who maybe goes on to the World Cancer Research Fund or the Cancer Research UK website to take issue with me on this, but I would say in my clinical practice, from what I've seen, things that tend to have the highest mortality rates are things like pancreatic cancer, particularly if it has already spread to another organ, and so they're not able to take it out with surgery. And the average, they look at things sometimes in terms of how many people who have this cancer are alive in 5 years' time, and the 5-year survival rate is about 5 to 7%. And then the other cancer that's particularly got a poor prognosis, particularly if it's in the advanced stages, is lung cancer. And that, again, has a very low 5-year survival rate. And so for lung cancer, it's very easy. One of the things that you can do that will absolutely reduce your risk is not to smoke, or if you are smoking, to stop smoking, to stop smoking. And even if you encourage people who are smoking to swap over onto vaping, we know that vaping is not as good as not smoking, but it's absolutely better than smoking. So you could kind of switch from that as part of your strategy, hopefully, to stopping smoking altogether. And even, say, for people who smoke, if you give up when you start treatment, there is still a benefit, so it's never too late, really, to stop smoking. For pancreatic cancer, there's not so much of a diet or lifestyle impact. But having said that, when I was looking at some of the stuff on dairy, then there was a decreased risk of pancreatic cancer associated with dairy intake. But I'm not saying that to say you should go out and have a lot of dairy. It's just that actually that was one of the things that I found out. But yeah, pancreatic cancer doesn't have as much of a lifestyle component as some of the other things.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we will have a look at turmeric. And this is something that often some of my patients come to me and they are already taking it, and they want to know whether they can continue to take it, or sometimes it comes up in the conversation because I might ask them whether they're taking any supplements or not. And so for those of you who are like, what's turmeric? It's also known as haldi or Indian saffron, and in its fresh form it looks very much like ginger because they're closely related. And the active ingredient that we feel is potentially helpful is called curcumin. I can't say the name that's underneath, that's the other name, but I'm not going to try and pronounce that live on YouTube. And so when they have done some studies just looking at what kind of effect turmeric might have, we know that it has antioxidant properties, and antioxidants are really good in terms of combating some of the free radical damage that goes on at a cellular level, so some of the stuff that we were talking about before, which can then trigger cancerous changes in cells. It's also anti-inflammatory, and anti-inflammatory changes are also known to be linked to cancerous cell formation. And then just to throw in, it's also antimicrobial and antiviral. And it kind of came into the forefront of people's minds because there were some communities who have what would be felt to be quite a high intake of turmeric or curcumin of about 100 to 200 milligrams per day as like a lifelong thing, where they had lower rates of cancer. So that's really kind of spurred the scientific community to have a look into it a bit more deeply and to think what could be giving this potential benefit. And it's felt that there's an anti-cancer effect by interacting with the immune mediators, so inhibiting the pathways that kind of help the cancer cells to evade that cell death, that apoptosis that we were talking about, and also to inhibit the initiation of proliferation and angiogenesis. So, and angiogenesis is the blood supply. So one of the things that also helps cancer cells to get bigger is that they seem to be able to switch on signals inside the body that kind of tell your cells or your blood vessels to kind of form new blood vessels that feed nutrients into the cancer. So some of the medicines certainly that have been developed have been targeting that pathway to try and stop new cancer cells and cut off the blood flow to the cancer cells and therefore to kill them. And it's felt that curcumin may be able to kind of dampen down those signals which kind of generate new blood flow for the cancer cells. And there's also a drug out there, or a turmeric supplement that contains a drug. So it's really, if you're thinking about taking turmeric, you want to be careful with this. And this is called Fortidol, and it contains something called nimesulide, and which I've probably pronounced wrong, but that actually is known to cause liver damage. So when you're out there, if you're looking at taking a turmeric supplement, you have to be really careful about the ones that you choose. And ideally, you would want to buy it from like a reputable company and be careful about the things you buy online. We may just need to do a bit more due diligence just to make sure you've got something that's safe. But when they started to look at curcumin, one of the things that we've realized is that it's really difficult to be absorbed. So it's something that is more fat soluble than water soluble, and our bodies are like over 80% water, and the blood, which is the way that most things are transported around the body, is mostly water. It's an aqueous type of solution with things dissolved into it. And so because curcumin is mostly more of a fat soluble thing, it's very difficult to get a good circulating level of curcumin in the body. So you have to take a lot of it to even get a small amount. So there was a study done where they gave people 8 grams of curcumin orally, and then they measured their blood plasma to see how much was in there, and there was less than 2.5 nanograms. And I'm not very good at maths, my sister will tell you that, but so I was online saying, how do you convert grams into nanograms? And basically, a nanogram is 1/millionth of a milligram, and a milligram is like 1,000 of those to a gram. So it is minuscule, the conversion rate. So that is some of the difficulties when you're looking at trying to get something that you know might be useful if it comes into contact with the cancer or to our cells. But if it's not easily dissolvable, so the body filters most of it out, how do you get enough in and how do you get it to the right place to do its job? So that's some of the things that the scientists are grappling with at the moment and trying to modify it to see, can they make it so that more of it will dissolve into our bloodstream so that it becomes more available. So it has a poor, what we call bioavailability, and that's like the ability of our body to incorporate it into our system so that it can be used to do the job that we want it to do. And that's because it's not very soluble in water. And so then what they found is that people who take very high doses for a very long time can have problems with their stomach and problems with their skin. So actually, it's not something where you could just say, well, just take loads of it anyway because it's pretty safe. It may not be that safe. And you may have some issues which actually would mean you don't really want to take high doses for a long time. So I did a bit of Google work yesterday when I was thinking, 8 grams, okay. They needed that much to get 2.5 nanograms in. How much is in the supplements that we have? And there was some that had about 180 milligrams and some that had about 30,000 milligrams. So not really anywhere close to 8 grams. That study was showing that you needed to even get a small amount of curcumin circulating in your bloodstream. So it may not necessarily be that helpful to take a turmeric supplement. So kind of as I was saying before, most of the studies are still in what we call the preclinical stage. They're mostly in the laboratory, and they have looked at combining turmeric or curcumin with different types of cancer cells to see whether it has any effect at all. And on all of these different types of tumor cells, turmeric was found to be helpful in inducing tumor cell death. So actually there's potentially a lot of promise for it. And there are some other trials now that are still ongoing, looking at using it in humans. Let me see if I've got it on the next slide. Yeah. So they looked at some patients who had types of blood cancers, AML, multiple myeloma, and there was some early evidence that it may help to suppress tumor formation. And there was a trial of what we call a phase 1 trial, so just really early work in colorectal patients. And they felt that actually with that, there was maybe an extra added benefit they used chemotherapy drugs, one with just the drug, another one with that plus turmeric, and actually there was an enhanced effect of in the group who were taking the drug and the turmeric. But it should be noted that they weren't looking at whether these people lived longer. That wasn't actually the outcome that the study was kind of what we say powered for. Like, it didn't have enough people in there to tell you that. And 2 of those people had significant diarrhea, but 2 of them had stable disease at 2 months. But it's just something that helps us to know that we need to kind of make the next steps and do more studies. So they had another look, and this was a trial that had 50 patients with CML, which is a type of leukemia, and they were taking a drug called imatinib, and there was an enhanced effect to the people who took imatinib and curcumin compared to the people that just had imatinib. So actually there's some early evidence that it may be useful if we can get the right doses in, and it may help the or the anti-cancer drugs to do their work better. And there are trials still being undertaken with breast cancer, prostate cancer, cervical and uterine cancer. So hopefully over the next couple of years, we'll be getting the results of those early studies to see whether curcumin is helpful in the fight against cancer in those types of groups. So watch this space, because we may be saying, actually, yes, certain types of curcumin in certain doses taken together with anti-cancer drugs actually may be helpful. But at this time, we don't have enough evidence to say that. What we do know is that it's not harmful to take it in low doses, but it may upset your tummy if you take it in high doses for a long time. So I think you have to be really clear about what you want to get out of it. before you start taking it. But it has an antioxidant effect, so it may be useful for other things. So we know that antioxidants are useful particularly for things like prevention of heart disease. So you may decide you want to take it from that perspective, but from a cancer perspective, it's early days, but there is some promising evidence or promising results coming through. Okay, are there any more questions, or shall I go on?
Yes, there are some questions. And the first one we have is, I'm 46 years old, diagnosed with myeloma cancer. It's still in the early stages. Any dietary recommendations?
Okay, so blood cancers are not ones that are particularly associated with kind of lifestyle or dietary factors. So what probably I would recommend is if that person is undergoing treatment, then that treatment can sometimes suppress the immune system. So you would want to be more careful with your food hygiene, your general hygiene, but also your food hygiene, and you may have to avoid, say, similar foods to things that maybe pregnant women would avoid, just to make sure that you don't pick up any foodborne illnesses. And the other thing I would say is that, you can get the same kind of benefits that other people can get who are having cancer treatment by eating well, maintaining your muscle mass, trying to be as physically active as you can. Even within lockdown, try to get out, try to be walking or doing something else that's going to keep your muscles going, because that is going to help you to get through the treatment better.
Thank you very much. The next one is, do you know whether or not alkalized water is beneficial to health?
Hydrolyzed.
Alkalized water.
Okay. Well, do you know what? I'm going to save that question because it's going to be answered in my next few set of slides. So is there anything else after that, or shall I just dive straight into acid and alkaline?
Sorry, come again?
Are there any other questions? Because I'm going to just focus on that for a bit of time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's one more question here, which is about hypothyroidism. And it says that, does it carry a high risk of thyroid cancer? And what diet can you recommend for hypothyroidism? So
hypo or hyperthyroidism? With an O or an E? Okay, so actually there's not a risk for either in terms of developing it, but actually they can be very well controlled with medication. So if it's a low thyroid level, you can be given thyroxine, and that will help to balance out your metabolism. And that's actually the problem with either an underactive thyroid or an overactive one, is that it really messes up your metabolism. So either it can lead to excess weight gain if the thyroid is underactive, and that's the thing that puts you at risk in the long term of cancers. If it's overactive, then it tends to drive you to have a lower muscle mass and lots of other things, problems with bones and all sorts of things. So actually, if you've got either, it's best to get that under control with medication through your doctor.
Thank you very much. I think these are the questions for now.
Okay, so that person who was asking about alkalized water, here come a few slides that will give you some answers. Okay. Can you see my slides? There we go. Okay. So this is something that I don't get asked a lot in my clinic, but I have had to give advice to quite a few of my dietetic colleagues who have been asked this very question. So that thing that person was asking about alkalized water, this is the people who encourage this diet will say that if you can keep your body more alkaline rather than being more acid, it will maintain health, and it may cure diseases, including cancer. And some of the thoughts about that is, in the science, we know that the cancer cells, because of the type of metabolism that they do, so they do something called anaerobic metabolism, so they don't use as much oxygen. It's a less efficient metabolism, but it helps give them extra kind of amino acids and nucleotides, so types of proteins that they can push forward into making new cancer cells, and that kind of drives what we call proliferation, so that cancer cell getting bigger. And so as a byproduct of that anaerobic metabolism, they produce lactic acid and they push that out into the bloodstream, and that causes the environment around that tumor cell or group of cells to become acidic. And that's out of sync with the natural pH of the body, which is kind of roughly neutral or maybe just slightly on the alkaline side. Like neutral is 7, 7.4 is maybe minusculely alkaline. So people's thoughts are that if you have an alkaline diet, you can redress this balance. You can also, if the cancer cells thrive in an acidic medium and you give it an alkaline one, you're then maybe killing the cancer cells. But actually, the body has very tight regulatory systems. So you can influence the pH of your urine, absolutely. And particularly if you eat lots of, say, even alkalized water or like green powders, some of those are sold by people, you can then cause your urine to become more alkaline. But the reason that you can affect your urine pH is because you can't really affect your blood pH. So your blood pH is very tightly regulated, kind of around 7.35 to 7.4. And it does that by using the urine, using your lungs. So if you've got too much acid in your body or it's building up, you breathe it out, and it prevents acidosis. And if you've got too much base in your body, then, which is the alkaline type of thing, then your kidneys excrete that, and so your urine becomes alkaline. But also your urine can be acidic if you, because it's a very kind of robust system. So your body can put a lot of those chemicals that it doesn't need or that could be dangerous into your urine, and you can then excrete it out of your body. So actually, you can't influence that tumor microenvironment with diet, because the body just really controls it very tightly. But that hasn't stopped people like this man, Robert Young, who comes from the States, from really touting having an alkaline diet as the miracle cure to many illnesses. And he even used to have cruises which cost quite a lot of money for people to listen to his lectures and to buy his book and to follow his diet and to buy his special green products, which if you take them would make your urine alkaline. But he was taken to court and he was convicted of practicing medicine without a license, and he was jailed for fraud as well. And basically that was because the diet that he was touting was based on absolutely zero clinical evidence. So he was getting a lot of money out of people under false pretenses. And as part of his statement, he had to read out in his guilty plea that he had no qualifications that were above a post-high school education from any accredited schools. He had to tell people he wasn't a microbiologist, he wasn't a medical doctor, he wasn't a hematologist, a naturopathic doctor, or even a trained scientist. So all things that he had used to kind of give some credence to the things that he was saying. It was absolutely none of those. So it's probably one of the few diets where I'd absolutely say there's nothing that supports it and I wouldn't advocate it. And also, the diet can become very unbalanced if you try to only eat things that make your urine alkaline, because it tends to exclude foods that have protein in. So it tends to exclude things like beans, lentils, pulses, dairy, meat, like absolutely huge swathes of the foods that give the nutrition that our body needs. So I would say it's quite a harmful diet. And I wouldn't worry about the water, and I definitely wouldn't try and follow the diet. Okay, are there any more questions? I think we're almost out of time.
I think there are no more questions at the moment.
Okay, so then in that case, I will move on to talk about sugar. So somebody had asked that, and it's one of probably the most popular things that's asked at the moment, it's kind of one of the things that goes round, and does it feed cancer? And I've kind of put a slide out there that, the people who are in the anti-sugar campaign box will say, yes, it absolutely feeds cancer. And yes, we know that cancer cells, like all of your other cells in the body, use glucose as their preferred medium for metabolism. So your body breaks down all of the nutrition that you eat into its most basic building blocks, and sugar is the most basic, or glucose, the most basic building block of carbohydrates. And in particular, the brain likes to use sugar as its preferred energy source. And so there is then that thought that there's something called the Warburg effect. So back in the 1920s, a scientist whose surname was Warburg basically started to understand some of the things about how cells work. And one of the things that they found was that cancer cells prefer to use glucose almost exclusively as their kind of food source of choice. So you can use things like ketones, and you can also use other things as metabolism, but the body prefers glucose, and cancer cells almost exclusively, or most of them that have what they call the Warburg effect, prefer glucose. So they also, and they use glucose because they go for anaerobic metabolism that we were talking about earlier. So using that glucose, but not using oxygen to metabolize it, and by doing that, providing extra building blocks that they can feed back into cell growth, so they're constantly trying to divide and grow and get bigger. So the thought for Warburg was that if you could influence the blood glucose by cutting off that kind of thing that those cells used, actually then you could kill the cancer cells. But it's a very simplistic approach to really feel that by just not eating sugar in the diet, you would then not have sugar in the bloodstream and you would kill off the cells. And you have to remember that these are your own cells. These are your own body cells, so they feed off of the same things that all of your healthy cells feed off, and they are much smaller comparatively to the rest of your body. So if you try to starve, you're going to kill your body before you kill a cancer cell, which might only be a few centimeters big. But there is some studies looking at how could you potentially reduce the amount of body glucose or glucose that you take into your body down to levels that are low, but not so low that it triggers your own body defenses and then it dissolves your muscles to produce glucose. And there's something called the ketogenic diet, and that may be something that you've actually seen or heard about in the media. So actually, there are some trials, clinical trials that are taking place now to see whether by modulating the diet, by kind of taking the carbohydrates right down, pushing up the fat intake, and also moderating the amount of protein, can you reduce the amount of glucose available to the cells right down, but not down so low that it triggers the release of your own muscle glucose. And there are about 11 what we call randomized controlled trials that have been undertaken so far, where they've put people onto the diet in a very random fashion, but controlled the diet so they can see the effect. And really, they're just looking at the moment. Feasibility, is it possible for people to do the diet? What's the compliance like? Because you can have an amazing diet that does all these things, but if it's so difficult to follow that people can't do it, they don't get the benefit. And what's people's quality of life like if you're taking out so many foods and so tightly restricting their nutritional intake? What's it actually like to live on that diet? So actually, the feasibility is, it is potentially possible to do that diet, but it needs a lot of support from a dietitian, and also the compliance is not amazing. So there's a very high dropout rate because the diet is so restrictive. Even with the support of a dietitian, with specialist nutritional products, it can be very difficult to follow. And so far, we haven't even gotten on to actually, are there any anti-cancer effect. So like before with turmeric, some of the studies have looked and said, oh, actually, yes, maybe there are some benefits, but not had enough patients in there to actually significantly, soundly say it has an effect. But there are quite a few more studies in the pipeline, so hopefully we'll get some more information about that in the future. And we'll be able to definitively say, does the glucose circulating in your bloodstream actually make a difference to cancer growth? Great, thank you. Hopefully you've all found this interesting/useful, and as I say, I'm absolutely available and happy to talk to people about things or to look things up if I don't know things new. Ask me great questions.
Thank you very much. I think we will have a word of prayer before we end. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this informative and educative lecture. It is our prayer that you help us to be able to implement some of these things in our lives so that we can live healthy lives. Thank you for Harris. We pray that you bless her as well. In Jesus' name, amen.